Well, good morning and also good evening to our online participants from here, US, and also from China. Welcome you all to today's webinar on renewing the US-China Science and Technology Agreement. And we'll be discussing can a science and technology cooperation coexist with technological decoupling. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China American Studies, which is a DC-based think tank focused on studies on many of the key issues affecting or concerning the U.S.-China relations, including science and technology, which we'll be discussing today. So this webinar convenes against the background of the impending expiration of STA in late February. So unless it's renewed or extended, the significance of the China-US STA goes much beyond the content, the specific content of cooperation. On the one hand, the agreement shows that even during the Cold War, major countries like US and China with different ideology, they could still reach institutional cooperation mechanisms in the fields of science and technology. And both China and the US were uncertain about its potential impact on their scientific and technological treasuries. So over 4 decades, however, these practices have proven that science and technology serve as a paradigm of cooperation and mutual benefit between the two countries. So this dominance has also emerged as the certain avenue for diplomatic reconciliation during the various crises between China and the United States. There are some concerns we are aware that, particularly within the US, which believe that the STA is no longer in line with the state of the China-US science and technology relations. So with the temporary extension period expiring very soon, the difference among the US policy segment remain. So I do not attempt to comment on these views, but do hope to hear discussion or debates on the questions such as can the US and China back the trend on technological decoupling and also renew or at least temporarily extend their STA? And what have been the main achievements and what are the chief criticisms level against this agreement? We are very delighted to invite two distinguished experts on this topic to join us today's discussion. We have Dr. Caroline WAGNER. She's a professor at the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at Ohio State University. Dr. WAGNER is an expert on science, technology, and innovation and its relations to public policy. Then we have Dr. Denis SIMON. He's a distinct fellow at the Institute for China American Studies. He's also a recognized expert on international business and technological issues, has more than 4 decades of very rich experience studying business, innovation, technology, or strategy in China. And this panel will be moderated by my colleague, Mr. Saurabh Gupta. He's a senior fellow and also the head of the Trade and Technology program at ICAS. The Trade and Technology program is a program aiming to analyze the evolving dynamic of US-China trade and technology affairs. And we hope to provide timely products on issues involving the development and expand public dialogue surrounding this critical topic. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nan. Good morning, good evening, and welcome to our event on the US-China Science and Technology Agreement. My name is Saurabh Gupta. I lead the Trade and Technology program out here. One doesn't have to explain that science collaboration, cross-border science collaboration and information exchange, how important it is, and particularly among two large countries and two scientifically gifted countries. We also should not be too pessimistic in this day and age, even when the two countries are in a competitive mode, that science and technology can benefit and that the two countries can make progress. If one looks back, it was at the peak of the Cold War when the US and the Soviet Union actually got together for their first what was the first human spaceflight, frankly. It was called the 1972 Apollo Soyuz test project. The Soyuz test project, and it was to emphasize the beginnings of detente in that relationship. Of course, we are in a very different age now, but that does not mean that the two countries cannot collaborate. In fact, there are very many good reasons why the two countries should collaborate. Anyway, let me step out of the way out here. Let me hand the floor over to two of our two of our speakers were the best in the business in this area. The format of the event today is going to be, this is a 1 hour event. We will promptly conclude at 10:30 Eastern. We will have the two panelists give their initial remarks. So about 8 to 10 minutes, we'll get into a discussion phase and we'll have question and answers after that. The short bios of both our speakers is with you, so I'm not going to go into any great detail. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Caroline Wagner. She is professor at the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. She is an expert on science, technology, and innovation and its relationship to public policy. She's had a very varied career. She's been a staff member on the Hill, written competitiveness legislation. She's worked in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, obviously now a professor, authored 2 books, been on various panels. Let me stop out here and let me hand the floor over to Dr. Wagner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh, and thank you very much to ICAS and to Nanghang for organizing the panel on this very important topic. I am quite committed to bringing as much light to this topic as we possibly can. My own research has focused on international collaboration in science and technology. And over the last years, the story there has been the rise of the US relationship between the United States and China. It has obviously been, to some extent, enabled by an agreement, a political and diplomatic agreement made between the two countries that began and they negotiated in the late 1970s. But in that time frame, and I'd like to share just a few slides with you, in that time frame, China has built a very robust international relationship in science and technology as they built up their internal capacity to conduct science and technology. And what we see is if we look at China's rise in the Web of Science, which is the gold standard of curation and database of science, the quality science that's been peer-reviewed and published in journals, we can see that China, beginning in as late as 1990, had very few publications in that Web of Science. But what we see in that red line going up exponentially over time is that China's representation in the Web of Science is now 25% of all of the Web of Science articles have a Chinese author in the article. And we can also see that China has overtaken the United States in terms of numbers. That is the first big change in the Web of Science representation since 1948, when the United States overtook the United Kingdom in terms of numbers of articles. So we see a very, very big sea change in the representation of quality science and China bringing to themselves, excuse me, important attention to their work. The blue line that you see there is China's participation in international cooperation in science. And what we can see is that even from the very earliest days of China's work, from the 1990s, China was very engaged internationally and worked closely with other countries. And what we see is around 2020 through 2024, China's international cooperation has dropped quite considerably. And you can see that in the blue line going down there. If we look at China compared to the United States, now we see the impact of the pandemic here, and we don't really know what the outcome is of the shift as a result of the participation of, or lack of participation of countries after the pandemic. But the gray line there you can see is United States representation in the Web of Science. That's not just international, that's all of its participation in Web of Science. And again, we see a drop off dropping below China. I'm so sorry. Sorry about my frog in my throat. All right, that we can see the US dropped in numbers of output after 2020, dropping below China's output and participation. These are a little bit old, so I apologize for that, but we can see that China's share in Web of Science and really from 2016, we've seen them overtake the United States, not quite beating out the EU 28. But the U.S. share of Web of Science is going down. It doesn't mean the U.S. numbers are going down. The U.S. numbers, in fact, continue to rise. It's just that the percentage share of work that's appearing in Web of Science for the United States has dropped. And that is really very, very important and different representation for the United States. More important than just the numbers of growth of articles is the numbers of people involved in these international collaborations. In 2022, there were 60,000 participants in articles between the US and China. China became the United States top partner in science and technology cooperation around the year 2015, 2016, again, beating out the UK, which had been the US's top partner in science and technology up to that time. So we really see, considerable changes. These are some data that we put together for the national academies. And you can see that the United States, there's a number of states that are more represented. Sorry. Where you see more Chinese scholars visiting. And what we found is that when we look at Chinese scholars, not students, but scholars who come to visit the United States, they tend to go to the states where they have institutions of high reputation. Some people might say, well, they're going where there's defense spending or there's more R&D spending, but we don't find that. In fact, we find that they go to the states that have more elite institutions. So I have lots more data, and anybody who's interested in the data, please get in touch with me. I have scads of articles and all the data on US-China cooperation if you'd like to know more about it. But the question today is about the Science and Technology Agreement. China is a bit unique in our relationships in science and technology. The United States doesn't have, and maybe it has now, an agreement with the UK or Canada. But these relationships in science and technology were highly organic, didn't have a political or diplomatic shield above them or umbrella above them. They began because researchers sought one another out for cooperation and began working together. And then eventually, perhaps, some kind of international agreement gets put on top of that. But the Chinese-US relationship began because of a political diplomatic agreement. But in the time since that agreement was signed, I think what we've seen is the emergence then of, huge numbers of people who are working together. And I think the question for us is how much is that going to endure with or without an agreement, a political agreement? How much does the political agreement influence that? My own sense is that is very robust now. There's considerable relationships between US scientists and their Chinese counterparts. And a lot of times scientists are considered to kind of be in the Republic of Science, right? That they are interested in knowledge creation and advancing the frontiers of knowledge and don't pay as much attention to that kind of political winds blowing one way or the other. Of course, they have to rely on funding, and funding has some political ties. But my sense is that a good amount of the relationship will continue without too much recourse back to the political. But for that, I think I'll turn to Denis and see if he agrees with that. And also, we can also discuss more about how much the political and the scientific are in tension or in cooperation. I'll pass.
Great. Okay, do you want me to move on, or?
Go ahead, Denis. Move on. Let me give you a quick introduction to you. They already have, I know your CVs, but still, Denis is as good as it gets in this business, recognized expert on international business and technology issues, 4 decades of experience studying business, competition, innovation, and technology strategy. He's been there at Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill, before that at Duke, and most prominently, he was Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University in China for 5 years before COVID. happened. Denis is a founding member of the expert group of the U.S.-China Innovation Dialogue, and I know he's keeping very close tabs on where the negotiations stand with regard to the STA. Denis, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks to ICAS for organizing the program, and as always, you always pick timely topics that are really central to the agenda in the bilateral relationship. In my brief time, I really want to talk about two things. First, the state of the discussions about the U.S.-China S&T agreement. These discussions have been tightly held in terms of information, but I think I've managed to put together the pieces of what I think has been going on. And second, I want to discuss some of the S&T reforms that have taken place recently and see how they might affect the playing field in terms of science and technology cooperation between China, the United States, and even the rest of the world. So as many of you may recall, the STA is an umbrella agreement, as Caroline noted. It was first signed in 1979 by Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping, and it has been renewed for every 5 years, the latest being in 2018. Even though it was done under the cover of darkness, without much fanfare, it was still renewed. And quite frankly, it has provided many mutual benefits to both countries. At first, it was much more asymmetrical in terms of benefit, but gradually over time, the benefits have accrued to both sides, and increasingly, given the enhancement of Chinese S&T capabilities, the potential for a real mutual benefit now greatly exists in terms of potential future cooperation. The agreement was due for renewal again in August 2023, but by mutual agreement of both sides, it was extended till February 27th, 2024, which is just right around the corner. And the reason for the extension was so that they could hold discussion and negotiation so they could incorporate a bunch of new factors that needed to be taken into account if there was to be any meaningful future science and technology cooperation. I think, as Caroline noted, there is some opposition to having a new science and technology agreement, especially from certain segments of the U.S. Congress. But I think the fact remains that both countries, both governments, at least seemingly entered into the negotiations in a good faith position, with the hope that some kind of new arrangement could be worked out. And as somebody once remarked to me, for the United States, whether China is friend or foe, we still need to have access and understanding of what's going on in China. In reality, I think the reason for this rethink that's going on has to do with the fact that the conditions that were present at the time of the initial STA and over the last 40 years, when the agreement was first signed way back when, a whole host of new issues now have gradually but steadily entered into the dynamics of the S&T relationship. And these factors clearly do require some kind of rethink. One could say that the old agreement had become obsolete in many ways, and these new factors have led to a reshaping in terms of the conditions of cooperation, and this is exactly what is being discussed over the last several months. Based on my understanding, there have been 2 meetings in China that were held to discuss what have been called the core principles of a new agreement. And a third meeting was recently held in Washington, D.C., with a visit by a Chinese delegation right before the Chinese New Year. And the discussions, at least from what I understand, have centered on 4 or 5 key issues. Number one, the issue of personal safety and security, particularly for participating scientists and related people who might, cross over the Pacific, to make sure that they will not be detained or harassed or anything of that sort, and that those who come can be assured that they can return home as they need to. The second issue has to do about data. Data was not a big issue until the recent 4 or 5 years, or at least data in the way it's being treated today. So issues like data security, data sharing, data ownership, and data access. These issues are perhaps of all the issues the most complex and require the most attention, and they're the most detailed in terms of the scope of the discussions that have been going on. The third issue involves reciprocity, transparency, and equal access, that there is a level playing field between the both countries, and that if Chinese scholars come to the United States and are given unencumbered access, American scientists, if they go to China, need to have somewhat similar terms and conditions for them to operate. A fourth issue is the issue of IPR. This is obviously a long-term issue. It goes beyond the previous adjustments that occurred in 1991 and in 2018 about IPR. And there's always some sense that we need to have a tighter ship in terms of the treatment of intellectual property. And then finally, a fifth issue, which may not be surprising, it's an issue of what is called discussion of good intentions. And that's aimed at reducing, I think, in my opinion, any kind of undesired transfers of know-how from so-called civil or intended applications and purposes for other use that would not be acceptable from the United States side. Of course, there are also issues that have to do with the scope of cooperation in terms of fields. The United States would like to have a much more narrow focused agenda, focus much more on climate change, health issues, food security, and maybe including clean energy. I think the Chinese side would like to see a broader set of fields discussed. And finally, there is the issue of dispute resolution about any kind of problems and issues that come up and how they are going to get resolved. Now, what makes this kind of negotiation more complex are really two key factors. One is the dramatic change, really, I have to say dramatic, in Chinese science and technology capabilities, as highlighted by Caroline. But gone is the hierarchy, the asymmetry, and the lack of parity from the earlier days when China was much more of a developing country. And the idea of China actually catching up with the United States was something that was not given much consideration at the time. And a second set of issues that make things more complicated is that issues like data security, for example, mean that many more players on the Chinese side, in terms of the Chinese bureaucracy, must be involved through internal domestic consultations. So, for example, whereas the Ministry of Science and Technology was pretty much the central player before, right now, the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the Cybersecurity Administration, et cetera, on the Chinese side, all must be brought into the discussions internally within China. And it enhances the level of complexity and tests really the scope and authority of the Ministry of Science and Technology. And many people I've talked to in the United States wondered when that February 27th date was set of whether the Chinese could get all of their ducks in line to meet that deadline, because there were some very challenging, difficult negotiations internally to happen. I also want to mention that in late December of 2023 in Trieste, Italy, a delegation from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Sciences met in order to discuss future collaboration between the two countries in view of the political difficulties that seem to be restricting or at least constraining a future collaboration. And they made a strong commitment to one another that particularly with respect to so-called global challenge issues, they would continue to move forward and continue to collaborate. The meeting ended in a very positive way, and it really, I think, bodes well for at least when we look at the role of the scientific community in both China and the United States. They do want to continue to work together. Finally, in the last minute or two that I have, let me just talk about how these new S&T reforms in China might affect the playing out of this agreement. In March of 2023, the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the State Council jointly issued a reform document that established something called the Central Science and Technology Commission. The CSTC took over the so-called strategic planning and policy setting functions for science and technology development in China. And the stated reason for doing this was to, quote unquote, unify leadership and to advance the performance of the innovation system. So with most becoming more of an administrative body, several areas of international cooperation have now moved out of the ministry and back into other functional ministries, such as agriculture and health, just to take two. And obviously, those relate to global health issues and food security issues. So obviously, these reforms are not even fully a year old yet, and how they're going to all work out is still yet to be determined. But what it does, it broadens the S&T landscape in terms of the numbers of key players now that could be actually or potentially involved in any kind of cross-border activity. And the last point I want to make is that we also have a new Minister of Science and Technology, Mr. Yin He-jun. Mr. Yin was the former Vice President of CAS. His expertise is in electromagnetic theory and microwave technology, and he is going to be responsible for running this new ministry that is supposed to help support the Central S&T Commission. So the continuing pressures coming from the United States in terms of restrictions on the flows of technology, and the newest one now being biotech and life sciences on the agenda, Xi Jinping now is really determined to make sure that China can enhance its level of self-reliance in terms of science and technology. The irony of all of this, of course, is that China benefited greatly from international engagement over the last 40 years. And if China hopes to advance the performance of its innovation system, it's going to have to remain globally engaged. And this is something that Xi Jinping is going to have to balance as he looks into the future in terms of these kind of cooperative endeavors, not only with the United States, but all of the major science and technology countries in the world. And with that, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Dennis. That was terrific. I think that much food for thought. Let's break out into the discussion phase right away. And to our audience, if there are questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will run it by our speakers. Dennis, let me come to you right now, right away, with that last point which you were making of the reform of the S&T institutional infrastructure in China. What are the real bottlenecks and the drawbacks in China's S&T ecosystem at this point of time, in your view?
So let me make one overarching statement, which sort of explains the curves that Caroline showed in terms of enhanced performance on the Chinese side, because I think that we need to understand where did all of this come from. And I've been working in the same project that Caroline has about talent for the National Academy of Sciences. And one of the things that we see is that the leadership has made a concerted effort to reduce the level of bureaucratic encumbrances and administrative tasks that typically had to be performed by scientists that limited the amount of time they had to engage in actual research. And basically, they've given them more incentive, more degrees of freedom, and more openness in terms of trying to make the system work better. We had heard a lot of admonishment when Wen Jiabao was the premier, particularly in terms of the period around 2012, that the government had radically increased its spending on R&D, but it wasn't getting a big bang for its buck. And I think that there has been this effort to improve the performance of the system, and I attribute the progress that has been made to the way that China has decided to deal in a more informed, better way with talent and how they manage talent. Nonetheless, there still are, as you said, bottlenecks. One is the geographic distribution of the talent. A lot of it is located on the East Coast, and yet there is a great demand for talent on the West. And so, unfortunately, while the market is wide open in places like Chengdu and Chongqing and Xi'an for more people in those locations, people still want to be in Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen. So this is the geographic distribution. Second has been the a shift away from the seniority system, and in particular, I think this is one that is moving ahead, but it still needs to move faster. And that is the ability to give young people a greater role in the R&D system because of the seniority system. It had been difficult for young people to kind of break through. But I think they now realize that those who have been more recently trained bring to the table the newest ideas, newer perspectives, newer ways of thinking, and they have an important role into helping to reshape the way the research agenda is set and is carried out. And finally, the last thing, which is connects all what we're doing right here, is the international engagement with talent. China has now decided to set up 3 international talent hubs, one in Beijing, one in Shanghai, and one in Shenzhen, the purpose of which is to attract international talent to spend time and to invest in building careers even within China. And they have gone out of their way to define quality of life perks that they're willing to give to people and their families to make it attractive to move to China. And the question will be, given some of the political difficulties that we're facing in terms of Chinese relations with the U.S. and other countries, will international scholars decide to go to China for any appreciable length of time? Will they be fully welcome? And what will they do in terms of issues like academic freedom and the ability to speak out if they have concerns, et cetera? So I think these are all 3 issues that need to be dealt with if the system is going to go to the even next level.
Great, thanks. I had a follow-up question, and that's why I'm going to come to you, Dennis, but also Caroline, if you could jump in thereafter, and I have a question for you on that. Sticking with what we were just discussing out here, does China have anything like, the US has this Bayh-Dole Act, which provides a sort of a pipeline, literally, from academic research to commercialization at the industrial stage? I think China would be very well served if it didn't have something like that, and they would be well served to study Bayh-Dole. But does it have something? Because I've heard about, there's a lot of good academic research, and yet there's not. There's a lot of good commercialization aptitude, but there's that pipeline, those backward linkages are not there between industry and academia. What's your view on this? And also, Caroline, if you could jump in on that too.
Sure. So, like many things in the United States, the Chinese have carefully studied the keys to the success of the U.S. innovation system. The U.S.-China Innovation Dialogue, just to take one example, was a platform in which they learned a lot about the good, bad, and ugly of Bayh-Dole and how it worked. And they have adopted a similar kind of set of regulations to help facilitate this. But as you've identified, there is unfortunately a big gap between industry and the research system, especially between universities. I did some work for one of the congressional committees on talent for the semiconductor industry. And one of the things that we found out is that a lot of the graduates that are being produced are simply not qualified to work in that industry because the equipment that they're being trained on is simply obsolete or too old. Industry is not providing the kind of infrastructure to these universities where they could produce graduates who have worked on the latest equipment, for example. So this kind of thinking, this gap that exists, is something that they've been trying to deal with for a long, long time. Even when I was at Duke Kunshan University, the interesting thing is that the ostensible purpose of the city of Kunshan in bringing in Duke was to create a Silicon Valley-like situation where the university became the source of know-how that could become readily converted into commercializable technologies. But that has not really happened. And to the great disappointment, Duke built a liberal arts university, not a polytechnic. And many of the people who are working on real science, basic science, and this conversion of science and technology to a commercializable know-how has not moved as quickly. State-owned enterprises are not the really bastions of innovation and innovative thinking, and so that leaves the whole sector of these companies like Baidu, the Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent, etc. But those, 2 years ago met with some really big difficulties. But nonetheless, I think the new premier understands that China needs a cadre of technological entrepreneurs to help drive innovation. And this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of taking know-how and putting it into commercializable know-how. And I think that hopefully the ability of these companies now to prosper once again is going to help the performance of the innovation system.
Thanks, Dennis. Caroline, if I may come to you, two questions, and actually pretty unrelated, frankly, the questions are. Question number one is, what would you say has been the standout feature of US-China science and technology collaboration, and how can that standout feature be preserved? Second question, quite different, but given your experience in government at OSTP, on Congress, etc., I'm assuming there are certain reporting requirements with regard to the STA that the executive branch has to make to Congress. Are these just kind of quiet disclosures which are made? Can these disclosures be made public so that a case can be built for and against, perhaps, or however? But is there a framework within which Congress and the executive branch on a continuous basis, at least Congress has certain oversight of that STA? What your views on that?
Yeah, let me address the latter part first. In my knowledge, the administration does not need to report to Congress on any kind of advancements under the STA. And I could be wrong. And if somebody who's listening has a better idea or knowledge about that, please jump in. But basically, these science and technology agreements are put in place. And we do have a number of them. The United States has signed a number of agreements with different countries. But they don't usually have any funding attached to them. They're more of a diplomatic and political agreement. Sometimes they enable things like shipping of tissue samples or soil samples and so on, getting export approval and visas for certain kinds of exchange. But the US government doesn't, as a rule, doesn't fund foreign researchers. We fund US researchers who in turn collaborate with people in different countries. There are exceptions, but for the most part, that is the case. So do you want to jump in on that, Dennis?
Yeah, so the way that this works is that through the Congressional Budget Office, which oversees monies that go to the White House and the various departments, let's take the Department of Agriculture. If they want to engage in a project with China, the Congress, Caroline is 100% right, doesn't review the content of the agreement or whatever and say, okay, we approve this because these are okay fields and they're no threat to national security or whatever. But when the budget of the Department of Agriculture comes up for consideration and they have a budget item, collaboration with China or something of that sort, that's when the difficulty may come in. Does the Congress want to fund the activities that could be covered under those agreements? So there is some degree to which budgetary elements controls by Congress could affect the activities that go on. This happened directly with OSTP during the Obama administration when John Holdren was the head of OSTP. Congress, through the Wolf Act, put a tight lid on, they couldn't even buy lunch for the visiting Chinese delegations because of the controls that had been imposed. They didn't like what he was doing with respect to China. So these kind of things do happen. They shouldn't affect the content, but somehow and indirectly they can affect the level of engagement, and I think that's important.
Yep. And Caroline, coming back to the previous question, what would you say has been the strongest area of collaboration or the standout feature of US-China collaboration among scientists? How can it be best preserved, or do you feel like that part of the relationship will persevere and continue regardless of where or what happens to the STA?
So, in a study that I did together with a number of people from Europe and China, we looked at US-China collaboration, and we found that about 25% of US-China collaboration might be called China-China collaboration. It's a Chinese scholar in the United States who's working with someone in China and a colleague in China and are co-publishing. Now, that is not unusual. That is the case with almost every country in the world. They send their scholars to the United States, they work here, and then they also work with someone from their home country. And it looks like international collaboration, and it is, but it is not exactly like an American-born collaborator. It is oftentimes somebody from that native country. So there is some of that that goes on. So to the extent that we limit mobility of Chinese scholars to come to the United States, we would see that drop off just from that part of the collaboration. The other parts of the collaboration are really quite robust across a broad range of fields. There isn't a field that stands out. There are a number of fields where China's doing fantastic work and where our scholars in the United States seek to work with Chinese scholars because of the excellence of their work. So the relationship can't be characterized necessarily as, one or two fields. It ranges across the whole of the areas of science and technology cooperation.
Um, Another question, and since you are at university, of late there have been quite a few news stories about Chinese students trying to re-enter and being at by customs at customs and border held back, and they've had difficult experiences. Is this just a few random, or do you think there's something a little bit more happening out here? We had, of course, the Justice Department's China initiative, and there were we know the issues that were associated with that. And what do you feel, or what is your view of the situation with regard to those reports that we do see in the media? And I think Wang Yi spoke about it just yesterday or day before at the Munich Security Conference that, hey, to Mr. Blinken, is this made out to be more than it really is, or is there really a genuine sense that there is that Chinese students, there is a degree of harassment of certain Chinese engineering and S&T students who are trying to come to the US? What is your view? Where do you come down on this?
I haven't actually heard from my own experience of anyone who's running into that problem. I've talked to our Office of International Affairs here at Ohio State University, and they haven't reported a problem. And students are getting visas to come study here and are actively seeking to come to Ohio State. In addition, I also host in my home some Chinese exchange students in high school, and they haven't had any problems getting their study visas. So my sense is that it might be a little bit overstated as to the problems. I was in China in October and I met with lots of students, and so many of them are anxious to come to the United States to study, and Ohio State is thrilled to have them. So my sense is that it might be a little bit overstated on that score. Yeah, Dennis, jump in.
Yeah, the numbers that we keep hearing are between 9 and 12 cases. Now, we don't know, those that haven't been reported. The State Department says that they've issued somewhere around 1,000 F1, J1 visas for people to come to the United States. So let's call it, 10 out of 1,000. It's a small number unless it's you. I should tell you, truth be known, that on my last visit to China last August, September, when I got back, I was asked to go through secondary review. And I had been going to China for 40 years, and I have never been stopped, asked once about anything. And when I went to the global entry, there was a big red, thing came up on the screen, And I had to go into the back room, and I was asked, why are you going to China so often? And what do you do there? And what's your purpose? And who do you meet? And et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, I'm an innocent soul and I have nothing to worry about. But nonetheless, it is somewhat disconcerting when you go to that back room. And if you're a young Chinese, whose first or second trip to the United States, it is very uncomfortable to be there. And the common element of all of this is that they're trying to catch these young people or the scholars in some kind of a lie or fabrication that they say they're coming for A, but they're really going to do B. And they're trying to sort those cases out. I mean, look, the United States has a right to defend its borders. As we all know, this is one of the biggest issues that the country faces right now. But at the same time, if we've issued these people a visa, we have to assume that they've been reviewed, their background has been reviewed. And so even if they appear a little bit nervous because they've been in a situation that they're not prepared to be in, I don't see why we're harassing these kids. I think we need to do a better job of screening at the beginning of the process. And if you really don't want to let this one or that one come into the country, then do so at that point, and not when they've flown 14 hours, they're dead tired, they arrive in San Fran or Boston or wherever it is, and they're just not up to that kind of interview, sometimes difficult interview.
I would mention, if I could, Saurabh, and that is that during the time of the Chinese initiative at Department of Justice, there were visitors that came to campus. I was on faculty council at the time, and universities in the United States are kind of famously independent, and at that time the pressure was to take a deep look at Chinese faculty and students at the university. And the university, and we were not alone, most universities pushed back on that and said, these are our colleagues, these are our students. This is not an acceptable way to treat people who are here as scholars and students. And so I think it's important to recognize that even within the United States, there are different roles for different institutions. The universities continue to welcome, scholars who seek to advance knowledge. More knowledge is better for everyone, and more educated people is better for everyone. That's kind of the mission of a university, and not to act in political as a political actor, deciding this, that, or the other thing in terms of who can come and who can't.
Absolutely. I am going to take one of the questions which is there in the question box and merge it with one of the questions that I had. Let me come to Denis on one point you made. You talked about IPR adjustments which were made in the S&T agreement in 1991 and 2018. Can you just give us a little brief background what those adjustments were? And then second question to both of you all is, how can this agreement be improved? Denis, I know you talked about the various areas. So what would you recommend in terms of if the agreement were to be improved? And I want to pair that with that question which says that if the two countries are unable to renew the agreement, what immediate challenges they might face?
Right. So in 91 and 2018, again, the Bernie platform really was IP. And so they spent a lot of time trying to come up with ways that they could pre-arrange the disposition in the treatment of the IP. The best case of this was the Clean Energy Research Centers, where they had negotiated a supplemental agreement focused on who would own the IP that came out of the collaborative research, what was the disposition of it, and who could claim quote unquote ownership of it. And by working that all out beforehand, they saved a lot of concerns and worries that somehow somebody was going to take advantage of the other side. And I think the 2018 edition was meant to follow up and follow through on what had been done with CERC, as well as some other things. Your question about what needs to be done to make a better agreement? Well, again, we were much more in a teacher-student kind of situation when this agreement was first signed, and for much of the 80s and maybe even a good part of the 90s, we were in that modality. And the asymmetries far exceeded any kind of areas where we really were close to parity and capability. But now we're a situation of almost equals. And when we come to the table, I think both sides have to recognize certain things have changed in the environment. National security becoming much more important to both countries. China's various new laws and regulations dealing with various aspects of security, including data security and cybersecurity, all indicate that they are very concerned about how their security is being managed domestically. We, again, through things like an initiative, unfortunately, use that vehicle to try to protect our security, and it proved not a very useful program. But I think that we have to basically lay on the table to one another what the principal concerns are. And so, I was a little bit surprised that so much attention was being given to this personal safety and security element because it had not been considered, a real major thing. But as you know, over the last 3 or 4 years, with media reports being what they are, assuming that they're at least somewhat accurate, there have been a couple cases, and so people have expressed concerns. The fact that China is categorized as a Category 3 country, which means if you don't have to go, don't go. And what does that mean? That means that you might get to go, but you might not get to come back. Now, that's, it's like hyperbole when you say that, because most of us who go have no worries because we're not in any particular danger whatsoever. And fortunately, most Chinese aren't. But there are a couple of cases on both sides where people do have some worries. And so the government wants to make sure, our government, and I think the Chinese government also wants to, have things like you won't poach our people and some other things like that. So everyone, I think, is trying to protect their interests. And the agreement before, as it existed, was too loosey-goosey. It didn't really consider this change in the security environment, etc. And now a new agreement will be much more reflective of where we are in 2024 than where we were way back in 1979. And I think that's what the hope is. Finally, just one quick comment. No agreement. What no agreement means is that science and technology cooperation does not have the blessing of Beijing and Beijing and Washington in any kind of formalistic kind of way. I think that blessing from the two governments is very important to give confidence, because I had a discussion yesterday morning with some people in the international education area, and then they all said the same thing. Universities are very reticent to go back to their collaboration with China because they have a feeling that they will get burned by the federal government in terms of their research monies and other different ways in which these universities need support from the U.S. government. So there is this skittishness, and if collaboration is going to really go forward, we have to find ways to overcome that skittishness that exists right now.
Caroline, if I might come to you and frame this the other way around in terms of scientific exchanges, S&T exchanges, but also broaden out the frame a little bit with regard to people exchanges. Chinese still come in ample numbers to the United States, but there are not that many American students going to China. And that was recognized by President Xi himself when he came out here and he said, yes, we need at least, I'm going to see that there are going to be 50,000 students, or et cetera, et cetera. What would your advice be to the Chinese side to make it a little bit more facilitative, that American students would feel more confident to come back to China in greater numbers? What would you say in this regard?
So mobility of researchers is a critical aspect of science and technology from ancient times, right? And the exchange of knowledge, dissemination of knowledge, and the dissemination of knowledge involves both explicit information, like things we've written down and articles and books and things, but it also involves a more tacit exchange where people become friends, they become colleagues, they know one another. When we've worked side by side in a laboratory, for example, with a student working at a university, the connection that people make becomes very robust, and it's a strong connection. People can retain those connections over decades. So many times a researcher who, for example, leaves the United States and goes to their home country continues their connections, even if it's not necessarily active at any one time, but it's kind of a latent connection in a global network of connections. And lots of times people will say, oh, do you know my former student, Dr. Lee, and recommend that person to connect with someone else from another country, from a third country. So these kinds of connections are critical to science. China has joined this global science system. The system in itself has its own norms and values and mechanisms of exchange. So China, in a way, comes into an already existing system, but that system has its ways of operating. So China has adapted to that. Chinese researchers have adapted to that. To make a home country attractive to visitors, number one is, are you doing high quality work? So China is increasingly doing very high quality work. People will want to go there. Obviously, the language barrier becomes an issue at any time when a country is working on science. To some extent, it defaults to English, but many times that's a barrier for people because of the language issue. So, these are problems that have been part of science from the beginning. We almost always find a way to deal with these problems. At one time, Germany was the world leader in science, and people had to learn German and travel to Germany and so on. So, these kinds of problems are manageable. They're not obstacles. So what gets to be an obstacle is when the political interventions change the pathways to interactions. So we need to encourage mobility and let people go where they will. You don't want to force people to connect and collaborate. That's usually very inefficient. But we want to create the conditions where people are bumping into each other, meeting, finding areas of common interest.
Great.
Can I just make one quick comment about this? So the issue of Americans going to China, particularly young Americans, we reached a height, I think it was 2011, of about 11,000 students. And as of 2022, we were down to 400 American students in China. We now may be up to about 700, but we're nowhere near 11,000. Xi Jinping in San Francisco put out an initiative to have 50,000 American students come over 5 years. It's not the 100,000 that Obama wanted. It's 50,000. And there is something called the U.S.-China Higher Education Dialogue in place now that is starting to think about how we can find perhaps a new cadre of American students that may want to go to China. Not the typical student that wants to study Chinese language or culture, but a group of students whose interests focus on China's role in these global challenge areas. So they want to study, what do the Chinese think about climate change? What do they think about clean energy? What do they think about global health issues? And they want to study these new dimensions because of China's more improved role, enhanced role in world affairs. And therefore, if they want to be global in their perspective, they have to know more about the Chinese case. So maybe they won't invest in the language, but they may invest in spending enough time there to gather that. I think that's a whole area that could be opened up to bring more U.S. students into willingness to go back to China and study there for anywhere from a summer to a semester.
Thanks, Denis. I see we are almost at the end of our time. Let's run this for 1 or 2 minutes more. Last question, because I do see one in the question box, and I want to add one question to that. To both of you all, the question is, who seems to want this agreement more? Do both sides want, or is one side wants this more? In your view, does any one side want the agreement more than the other? And the second question, which is my question added on, is, so what is your prognosis forecast of what's going to happen next? Will something happen Feb 27th? Will it be temporarily extended by 6 months? What happens next on the STA? If you all can just have a quick 1 minute for each, for both of you all on these questions, please. Thanks.
Okay. I think the scientific community in both countries want this agreement. I think that they want it for its symbolic purposes, and they also want it for that blessing I mentioned that it bestows to give people confidence in the collaboration. And I think that the relationship of collaboration would suffer if we don't have this, because it would be seen as an overt act of not having the endorsement of the both countries. And I think that would not bode well for the future of collaboration.
Caroline, what do you feel is going to happen next going forward this year on the STA? Temporary extension, renewal? What's your view?
I can only say my hope is that we do come to an agreement. I know there are different views within the United States. Congress has spoken up actively with concerns. I think we can deal with those concerns. I do believe the relationship is important, and it's important for both countries at this time. And so the more we can come to an agreement that allows people to continue on working together, I think the better off science is, innovation, and international relations.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Dennis. Very, very illuminating. Let me hand it back to Nong to give closing remarks. A word or two, Nong. But thank you very much, Caroline and Dennis.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. It's an excellent discussion. I do benefit from your sharing your expertise and also very engaged discussion. And thank you, Professor Wagner. Thank you, Professor Denis SIMON. And we look forward to hosting you in the near future. And we also hope to be engaged with more with our participants online in the near future on this topic and also on other ICAS research topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.